Hello, Laverne here, and thank you for joining me. May this video be a blessing to you, and may it honor and glorify God in His kingdom. This video is in response to one made by Greatbigbore, an atheist who brought up some points in Scripture having to do with signs, wonders, and miracles. He wants to know why we don't have evidence of these things happening. And he believes that because we don't have evidence, that it's a good reason to discard Scripture and to think of it as nothing more than a myth. Well, in explaining these things, it's going to take more time than what it took him to ask the questions. So I'm not going to be able to get to every point that he brought up. But hopefully I'll be able to address most of them. Now, the first one he brings up is the age of people during the story of Genesis. According to him, we should have evidence of this actually happening. That when we look at the remains of people from roughly 4,500 to 6,000 years ago, we should see signs that they actually lived to be 900 years old when we look at DNA and the genes and so on and so forth. But is there actually a science out there that could identify someone being 900 years old? Or would they simply look at their joints and look at the wear and tear on their teeth, their joints, and so on, and from that base their conclusion of the age of the person on how we think somebody ages? In other words, would their assumption, would their findings, conclusions be based on the way they understand people aging today? Would they even be able to do a test that would identify someone as being 900 years old? If someone knows the answer to this, I'd appreciate it, but as far as I know, there is no test that could identify someone being 900 years old. Now, he also talked about growth in population. That if we had a time when people were living to be 900, you would expect to see a population explosion. And then when people's age was reduced to no more than 120, then you'd see the population growth fade off, drop off. And according to him, we don't see this evidence. But would we be able to identify these kinds of things from, roughly 5,000 years ago, 4,500 years ago? Would we actually be able to identify whether or not there was a population growth and then a die-off? We don't know what kind of diseases there were at that time. We don't know what kind of catastrophes that could have taken place to kill off a lot of people. We don't know these things. Also, we don't know what a person's sex drive would be at age 700. We can't assume that just because they were in the same, health-wise as somebody who was 30. Let's say somebody at 500 had the same, or was in the same kind of health as somebody who was 20 or 30 today. Does that mean that they would still have the same sex drive as when they were younger? We don't know this, and we can't assume that they would. Therefore, we can't assume that people would still be having children at age 700 at the same rate they would when they were 30. Let's look at the women. Do you really think a woman, if they gave birth to 30 children, by the time they were, 150, 200, that they would want to continue with the childbirth thing? Do you think they would still have the same sex drive? So we can't assume these things that Greatbigbore is talking about. And the fact that we don't have evidence of population growth and a slowdown is not evidence that this did not take place, that Scripture is false. There's no evidence of this. Now, let's look at the Great Flood. According to Greatbigbore, there should be evidence of this. Well, there actually is. We look at the different stories around the globe, and pretty much every civilization talks about a great flood. So we do have evidence of a great flood. It may not line up with your interpretation of Scripture, but the evidence is there. There are also scientists who claim that the earth does reveal that there is physical evidence of a great flood. So we do have the evidence. The problem is it doesn't line up with his interpretation of Scripture. Now we have to read Scripture in the context that it was meant, that it was given to us. For example, the whole earth, the whole world. What does that actually mean? Well, if you talk to many Americans, that means the United States. I say this because when I was in the armed forces and stationed over in Europe, the Americans very commonly said it was how they talked about the United States was it was the world. I can't wait to get back to the world. That's how they referred to where they came from. Now imagine 4,500 years ago, how they referred to the place that they lived, the area that they knew, that region. It was referred to as the world. In the same way that Americans refer to the United States as the world. We also have to take in consideration that the context of the story has to do with Noah being tested. That Noah is part of the lineage of Christ. And all throughout biblical history, we see certain people in the lineage of Christ being tested. Abraham, Jacob, David, all of these people being tested to great lengths. So we have to read scripture in that context, and when we do, there is all kinds of evidence to back it up as to the great flood actually taking place. Now I'm going to skip ahead to the Exodus from Egypt. This is actually one that is fairly easily explained, and I want to spend some time addressing it. When we look at the history of Egypt, and this is easily done through simple searches on the internet, you'll find that it lists all the different pharaohs and the dynasties going way back even before the Exodus. And what it tells us is that for approximately 100 years at the time of the Exodus, there were people in power who were not even Egyptians. They had come into power as an invading force. Now, it's not known, and this goes to show how poorly the Egyptians kept records. We know for a fact that there was this civilization called, and I'm not sure about the pronunciation, but I'll include a link to it, Hyksos or Hyksos. This civilization came into Egypt, and for a period of 100 years roughly 100 years were in power. Then we see the Exodus, the slaves leaving, and it's at that time that we see this civilization, this group of who were in power, who were not Egyptians, this invading force, were then kicked out of Egypt. So this lines up with scripture. What we see is that this invading force came in. We don't know if they actually came in as a military force or slowly came in and through economic power took over Egypt, but we know that they did. And then we see the Exodus, and at that time these people are then kicked out of Egypt. So this lines up, and this makes sense that their military might followed the Hebrews. They were destroyed in the Red Sea, and then it was easy for the Egyptians, the true Egyptians, to kick them out of power. And they were basically exiled. And then we never see or hear of them again. These people who were in power in Egypt at the time of the Exodus simply fade away into history. We don't hear anything more of them. Now, scripture doesn't identify that, this group of people or this other civilization that was in power. We simply hear them being described as Egyptians and as the Pharaoh and so on. But that was the way back then in writing. We don't see scripture identifying these people who came in and took over Egypt, but we do know what happened, and we do know that they were kicked out of Egypt right after the Exodus, or right around the time of the Exodus. Now, we look at what took place in the wilderness. According to Greatbigbore, we should have evidence of that many people being in the wilderness for 40 years. But let's look at the recent history and the kind of things that have happened in the last 100 years. Let's look at World War I, World War II. We see in World War I, Germany decimated. A few decades later, we look at the restrictions that were put on Germany and the military that they were allowed to have. Hitler found ways around it, and a few decades later was back to a world power again, threatening the world. Let's look at Japan. They were decimated in World War II. A few decades later, they're an economic power. And yet, according to Greatbigbore, because of the Israelites leaving Egypt, Egypt should have been decimated. That, They shouldn't have remained a world power and so on. But we see in recent history that that's not the case, that countries can go through those kinds of events and still remain in power. Especially when you consider what happened, that a military force that had taken over Egypt, that they were exiled after the exodus of the Hebrews. I mean, it all fits. And looking for evidence of them being in the wilderness, it's just ridiculous. Let's look at Germany in World War II. Roughly 6 million Jews exterminated. And yet, imagine this, 3,500 years from now, would you expect to see evidence of this? And yet, according to Greatbigbore, we should see evidence of the Hebrews wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years. We should expect to see evidence of this, so many thousand years later. It's utterly ridiculous, the kinds of things that Greatbigbore is asking. Now I'm going to look at the story of people following Jesus, large crowds of 10,000. He wants to know why we don't see other people writing about this. Why isn't there, people outside of Christianity writing about this? Well, the answer is simple. The Romans and the Jews were doing everything they could to eradicate Christianity. They were trying to erase any evidence whatsoever of Jesus. So they're not going to write about these kinds of things. They're going to deny them. The Jews and the Romans were doing everything to burn the writings of the Christians, to eradicate any evidence of Christ. So of course you are not going to find other evidence from other people writing about Jesus and the crowds following him. Greatbigbore, this is so easy to reason. I just can't believe that you are asking the questions that you are asking. And what's even more amazing is that so many other atheists are falling all over this, that they just eat this up. I just find it so amazing that atheists claiming to be rational and logical are actually the most illogical and irrational people. As a group of people, they are actually the most irrational and illogical. All right, as always, I look forward to comments and messages. Till next time, peace and blessings.